Erev Shabbat Shalom Rabotai. We are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Pesachim. We are up to Perek Hey Mishnah Aleph. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilun Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbai and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. The next 5 chapters of this Masechet deal with the sacrificial service of the Pesach offering. This is the section that was known in earlier times as Tractate Pesach Sheni. Now the Mishnah begins to discuss the laws of the Pesach offering. We know every Jew is required to bring a Pesach offering on the afternoon of Erev Pesach and to eat it that night. A person does not usually bring this offering on his own, rather as part of a group who eat its meat together. The Mishnah starts by describing the procedure for slaughtering the offering on the afternoon of Erev Pesach. Now every day, 2 communal offerings known as Tamid offerings were brought in the temple, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. Many other offerings were brought throughout the day, and as a rule, they all had to be brought between the 2 Tamid offerings, meaning no offering could be brought before the morning Tamid, and no offering could be brought after the afternoon Tamid. An exception to this was the Pesach offering, which was brought on Erev Pesach after the afternoon Tamid. Because of this, the afternoon Tamid had to be offered earlier than usual to allow time for the Pesach offerings. This Mishnah teaches when the Tamid was brought every day and when it was brought on Erev Pesach. The Mishnah begins, Tamid nishchat b'shmone umechetza v'karev b'tesha umechetza. The afternoon Tamid was slaughtered on ordinary days at 8.5 hours after sunrise and burnt on the altar at 9.5 hours. Now the commentaries explain that Tamid was slaughtered on ordinary days at 8.5 hours after sunrise. That's 2.5 hours after noon. Now the hours mentioned throughout the Mishnah do not consist of 60 minutes, but are Shaot Zmaniot seasonal hours, each of which consists of 1/12 of the day, no matter the day's length. So the length of each hour therefore varies with the season. Now, the process of bringing the Tamid, which began with the animal slaughter and ended with it being burned on the altar, took up a full hour. So it was slaughtered in ordinary days at 8.5 hours after sunrise and brought at 9.5 hours. It took about 1 hour. Now the afternoon Tamid must be brought during the afternoon hours of the day. The earliest it can be brought is when the sun has clearly begun to move to the west, which is half an hour after noon, 6.5 hours after sunrise. Generally, it's brought later than that to allow time for all private offerings of the day to be brought before it. And the Mishnah continues, Be'arvei Pesachim, on Erev Pesach, when more time was needed in order to bring the Pesach offering after the Tamid, Nishchad b'shevo mechetza v'karev b'shmone mechetza. The Tamid was slaughtered at 7.5 hours and brought on the altar at 8.5 hours. Now the Pesach offering had to be brought after the Tamid, but before sunset. Since every Jew had to be part of a Pesach, the Kohanim needed enough time to bring a great number of offerings before sunset, and they therefore usually brought the Tamid earlier than usual. They therefore brought the Tamid earlier than usual. Ben bechol ben b'Shabbat. The Tamid was brought at these times both on weekdays and on Shabbat, although less time was needed on Shabbat because no private offerings were brought. The weekday schedule was kept to avoid confusion. Now, after the Pesach was offered in the temple, its meat was brought to the place in Yerushalayim where it would be eaten and it was roasted. When Erev Pesach fell on Erev Shabbat, it had to be roasted before Shabbat. Now, when Pesach was on a weekday, it could be roasted even after dark, since food may be prepared on Yom Tov. On Shabbat, however, roasting may not be done. So to allow time to roast it before nightfall, it was slaughtered earlier than usual. Chal Erev Pesach liot be'erev Shabbat. When Erev Pesach fell on Friday, Nishchat b'shesh umechetza v'karev b'shev umechetza. The Tamid was slaughtered at 6.5 hours and brought on the altar at 7.5 hours. Now when Erev Pesach is Friday, the Tamid is brought as early as the law allows, as the Rav says. V'apesach acharav. And in all cases, the Pesach was brought after the Tamid. That is the end of Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Ben now continues, the main part of an animal offering is the blood service, the procedure of collecting the animal's blood and throwing it on the wall of the altar. This consists of 4 avodot, 4 services: slaughtering the animal, shchita, receiving his blood in a temple vessel, kabbalah, bringing the blood to the altar, holacha, and throwing it on the wall of the altar, zirika. Now, although other services are also done when bringing an offering, for example, certain parts are burned on the altar and the meat is usually eaten, it's only the blood service that is essential. If part of this procedure is omitted or done incorrectly, the offering is invalid. While the other services are important, the offering is valid even if they are not done correctly. These services must be done for the sake of the correct offering. If the Kohen should have in mind to do them for a different offering, for example, if he brings a Korban Olah and has in mind during these services that it should be a Shlamim, the quality of the offering is affected, which we will speak about as we go on in the Mishnah Pesach Hashem B'li Neder. This Mishnah teaches the law for a Pesach whose blood service was performed for the sake of a different offering. Ha-Pesach sheshechato shelo lishmo. A Pesach that a person slaughtered not for its own sake, meaning with the intention that it be a different offering and not the Pesach. V'kibel v'ilech v'zarak shelo lishmo. Or if he received the blood in a vessel, brought the blood to the altar, or threw it on the altar not for its own sake. Or lishmo v'shelo lishmo. Or if it began one of these services for its own sake, for the sake of the Pesach, and continued the same service not for its own sake, meaning he changed his intention during the service. Or shelo lishmo v'lishmo. Or he did the reverse. He began one of the services not for its own sake, and then continued it for its own sake. Pasul. In each of these cases, whether he performed one service or even just part of one service for the sake of another offering, the Pesach is invalid, even though he performed the rest of the blood service with the proper intentions. And the Mishnah gives examples for the last two laws. Ketzad lishmo v'shelo lishmo. What's an example of beginning a service for its own sake and continuing not for its own sake? L'shem Pesach u'shem Shelamim. One began the service for the sake of the Pesach and continued it for the sake of the Shelamim. Now the same applies if he has any other offering in mind. The Mishnah gives the example of Shelamim to teach that although a leftover Pesach is used as a Shelamim, as the Mishnah writes in Masechet Zvachim, chapter 1, Mishnah 3, a Pesach offered on Erev Pesach for the sake of a Shelamim is considered for the sake of a different offering and is invalid. Shelo lishmo v'lishmo. What is an example of starting a service not for its own sake and continuing for its own sake? L'shem Shelamim u'L'shem Pesach. One began the service for the sake of a Shelamim and continued it for the sake of the Pesach. And that is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody should have an Erev Shabbat Shalom. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.